Hello, I'm Nils from the Captury, and this is our tutorial on Capture Studio. At Captury, we develop two main products, Capture Live and Capture Studio, and the only difference between those two products is that Capture Live gives you the additional option of tracking in real time. In this tutorial on Capture Studio, we show you the two main workflows. One uses external cameras like action cams or phones or whatever you have really. You record with them outdoors, on the go, wherever. Then you go home, import the videos into Capture Studio and do the processing. In the second workflow, all the cameras are connected directly to the computer running Capture Studio, and you do the recording with Capture Studio. This simplifies the workflow but requires a bit more infrastructure. So for the first workflow, we'll take a bunch of these trusty old GoPros and go to a park. The first thing we do is set up the tripods. Ideally, you want the cameras somewhat higher than head height and angle them down a little bit. These tripods are a bit smaller, but this should do. Ideally, you have to consider is that all cameras need to be able to see the entire tracking volume all the time, including the feet and the head. And if you want to raise your hands above the head, then you need a little bit of margin above the head as well. And how far you need to place the camera from the tracking volume depends on focal length and some other camera properties. Generally, I recommend adding a little more safety margin than you think you need, because it's much better to have a little bit of unused space in your video rather than cutting off the actor. Once we're happy with the camera setup, we have to calibrate the system. We use a two-stage calibration. In the first stage, we calibrate lens distortion and focal length parameters, like the intrinsic camera parameters. And in the second stage, we calibrate the volume or the position and orientation of the cameras. Both of these calibrations are performed with the calibration board. You can print out a PDF from our website and stick it onto a flat, sturdy surface. In the lens calibration, you take this board and you walk up really close to the camera and you hold it at an angle to the camera and swipe it across the field of view. Make sure you do it at different distances, because sometimes it's a bit hard to estimate at which distance you actually have to hold it so that it's not too close but not too far away either. In the volume calibration, you walk around with the board and try to show it to as many cameras as possible. So typically I'd start at the center of the volume, turn around and then walk in a circle, showing it to the inside of the volume. And then you can also walk diagonally across the volume. When you hold the board, make sure that you don't cover any of the squares with your hands. So I typically hold it with just my thumb from the top edge of the board. And at the end, place it on the ground for setting the floor. When you actually record the tracking, make sure you start with an A pose. In a T pose, people sometimes cramp their shoulders or raise them. So you want a relaxed shoulders A pose, feet apart. Then you should normally start with like a mini range of motion. Move all your major joints so that the system can better learn how long your limbs are and where exactly your joints are. In terms of clothing, I recommend tight-fitting clothing that doesn't match the color of the background. So this is the user interface of Capture Studio. Down here you have the shot management panel, which allows you to manage your shots. The first thing you typically do when you start a new project is you select the project directory, which can contain one or more shots. And you can do that by double-clicking here, or you can open it here with Open Project Directory, or down up in the menu, Open Project Directory. So I've already selected the folder where all my videos are that I copied from the GoPros, so I'm already good. So the next thing I have to do is I create the actual shot, which I do with this icon with the import down arrow, and I'm just going to call it GoPros, and that opens this dialog, which allows me to select the videos. So I'll just have to keep adding them. Do note that the frame rate gets selected automatically from the videos that you have. And the next thing we have to choose is whether we want to link to the original videos or whether we want to copy them, which obviously takes more space, but then you have everything in one place. And if you delete the original videos, the shot will still work. Third option is to import the videos as motion JPEG, which makes the scrubbing much faster, but these videos get very big, so I don't necessarily recommend it unless your video codec is very slow to parse. If you have a camera calibration file already, you can browse for it here and import it, essentially. So besides the calibration format that we develop ourselves, we also support the calibration formats from Vicon, OptiTrack, Qualisys, BTS, and a few others. So I'll just hit OK here, and that just opens this shot. And here you can see, and now I have these cameras in the left panel. I can switch to them between this preview kind of view and the list view by right-clicking and show previews or show list. For performance reasons, I normally use the list view actually. You can double-click the main view to switch to a single camera or to all cameras, and you can double-click into one of these views to switch to one of those cameras. You can also use the numbers, like 1 for switching to camera 1. Yeah, that's the main navigation. If you want to go to a 3D view, you can zoom out. So zooming is done with the mouse wheel. So if you just zoom out from your fully zoomed out view, it zooms to 3D. You rotate in 3D with the middle mouse button, and shift middle mouse button translates. You can also switch to a Maya navigation mode in the navigate menu, and then you can do the Alt left button, right button, and middle button. But I'm a Blender person, so I use the default view. Alright, so the first thing we have to do is we synchronize the cameras, and I don't have a button for it in the toolbar by default, so I have to go in the ... and then at the very bottom there's the sync panel. Alright, so I can switch cameras by clicking on these entries as well. So now I'm going to search for a frame that I can easily identify, and I know that I did a jump, and that the jump landing is something that I can easily see. So I just have to scrub through the video and find it. So there's the action, and then there's the jump here. So I'm just going to pick the last frame with motion blur when I land. Okay, so this is my frame. So now I have to just go through all cameras and repeat this. Alright, so now I've selected the frame in all my cameras, and I'm just going to hit apply. And now you can see that the frame number for this particular frame is now all the same. So let's find the jump again. Okay, so that's close enough. So now we can see with the hairs flying in the same way in all these different frames. So I think we're good. Let's save this. You can hit Ctrl S or go File, Save Shot. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is calibrate the cameras. And we have a two-stage calibration. The first one is the lens calibration, and the second one is the volume calibration. So lens calibration is also called intrinsic calibration, and there we just kind of go up to one camera and we calibrate the lens parameters of that particular camera. So I'm just going to scrub to the frame where my lens calibration starts. I'm also going to make sure that we have the right board selected. So this has 6x4 squares, and it has color squares in the center. So this is the right preset. If you have a custom board, then you can just hack in the numbers here, and this should also work. Alright, so just hit capture, and you can see that it kind of tells you where on your view you already have enough data, and I try to cover the field of view as much as possible. Maybe I was a bit too fast, there's a few motion blurred frames, but you can see that there's essentially everything's green except for some of the corners, but those don't really matter. So you don't have to have like a perfectly green coverage, but roughly. Alright, so I just stopped the capture and I just hit calibrate lens, and I get a very good error, 0.8 pixels. I only did the lens calibration for one of the cameras because I know that these are all the same GoPros and I used all the same settings for them. So I just copy the intrinsics, like the lens distortion parameters, from one camera to all the other cameras. And for that, I'm just going to go to the shot. No, I'll actually save it. Then I go to the shot, And then I just open this camera calibration file in a text editor, and then I'll just copy this stuff. So I'll just Control-C, copy it, and I'll just paste it for all the other cameras. So you can see that the distortion parameters are all 0, and now they actually have values. So if your cameras are not the same, or this hacking the calibration file is not for you, then you can also just capture the lens calibration for all your cameras separately, and that should also work. Well, that's the standard way of doing it. This was just a shortcut essentially. Now I just need to make sure that we reload the shot or the calibration, so I just go import calibration. So this is also an option if you realize that you actually have a calibration but forgot to add it in the import shot at the beginning. Alright, so now we see that the lens, the focal length is all the same, and we can also look at all the other values down here. So if we switch here, now we can see that there's lens distortion parameters and lens center offset and all these technical things. Alright, so this is the lens distortion. Like once you have a lens distortion, this shows you the undistorted view. So if I switch to capture mode, you can see that it kind of toggles and kind of seems to zoom in a little bit. And that just shows you the difference between the distorted and the undistorted view. So we set the GoPros to narrow mode, which has fairly little fisheye lens distortion. That's why the effect is not as drastic as you would see on like the wide mode, but you can still see it. One way of verifying that your lens distortion is good, besides the error in the table over here, is to actually look at the image. And if you actually do see straight lines in the image, then those should actually look straight. So it's just another way of kind of sanity checking your calibration. In this particular scene, there isn't a lot of really straight things. I mean, the trees are kind of straightish, but not straight enough that we could tell whether it's distorted or not. So the next step is the volume calibration. If I just hit detect, you can see that it starts detecting these boards, and there's all these red dots. And once you have enough dots or detections for a particular camera, the detections start turning green. And now we already have enough for cameras 3 to 6. We just need a little more data for camera 1 and camera 7. And camera 1 is good now too. Just a little more for camera 7. When you do capture these calibrations and you're outdoors or somewhere away from like a real-time feedback for the calibration, do make sure that you capture more data than you think you need, because it's super annoying when you go home and realize that you don't have enough data for your calibration. So this is kind of light green on camera 7 now. I think that's probably good enough. Just stop the calibration here and hit the calibrate button. So the last step we have to do is we set the floor. So there's two different ways of doing that. Close this. The normal way is that you just put the board on the ground and then you hit set floor, and that's just going to give you the coordinate system origin and kind of the orientation of the board. Especially in outdoor settings, sometimes that's like it doesn't manage to detect the board, and for those cases we have kind of a backup solution, which is we set the floor vertically. And in that mode, you put the board on the ground so that the short edge is on the ground, and you hold it vertically. It doesn't have to be perfectly vertical, but kind of vertical. And then you hit the set floor. And that actually just detects these points on the bottom of the board. And since this is ambiguous, and if your board isn't perfectly upright, this is going to give you a slanted floor. So what you have to do is you kind of do it multiple times. So I just moved and rotated it a little bit, and then I hit the refine floor. And if I do that like 3 or 4 times, then this is going to give me a very accurate floor estimate. You can also move the board a bit more, like you kind of make the space where you put the vertical floorboard a bit bigger, and that's going to give you an even better estimate of the floor plane. Let's go with this. I'll save it, Control S. Now we're already done with the setup. So the next step is track. You just have your subject stand in the center of the volume, and then I just drag the skeleton on myself or on the subject, and then it just keeps tracking. Tracking can be a bit faster if I switch to the 3D view, so that's what I'm going to do now. There's multiple views you can look at with a skeleton. You can switch between them by going skeleton, and then you have these different visualizations, like this. But you can also hit S to toggle through the most important views. Generally, it's a good idea to enable the post-processing filter. So I think that's it. Let's cut here. But I'll actually walk out of the volume and then I'll walk back in. And let's just do the second take as well. So I can just drag the skeleton, or I can actually specify some settings. So I can disable this, and then the skeleton's not going to have fingers. You can see that in here. But we want fingers, so there's the fingers back. Then there's this option of adding ribs. So this adds these rib bones. Twist bones you can also add. You can't really see it here, but there's additional bones in the middle of the upper arms, thighs, and I think lower arms. We don't need those here, so I'm just going to drag the normal skeleton on top of myself and drag the second thing. So now I have two skeletons here. I could have also reused the one that I already scaled, but I just wanted to show that you can have multiple skeletons. Here with this eye icon, I can hide the skeleton. It's still there, it's just not visible. And with this green toggle, I can turn tracking on or off. And you can see in the timeline now the blue track is completely gone, and now it's back. I'll just switch to 3D again, so it tracks a bit faster. So now we've captured these two little actions, and now you can see that down here it's actually filtering. Like when you stop tracking, it always filters what you just tracked, and that just takes a few seconds. And then next to it you see this raw, and once the filtering's finished I can click on it, and that's going to switch the view from the raw unfiltered view to the filtered view. So this is filtered. If I click on it, and it's raw and filtered again, and you can see that in particular the feet are much more jittery in the unfiltered view. So yeah, we managed to record some action. I'm just going to save this very quick. And the last thing we have to do is actually make it usable in other applications. And for that we need to export this in a format that other applications can import. For configuring the export settings, you can reach that here, go settings, or you can right click it and go export settings, or under settings there's also the export settings. And that opens a dialog, and that allows you to select which file format you want to export, FBX, PVH, C3D, or some comma separated values like raw data for all the joints. And in particular for FBX and PVH, and there's also these presets up here which allow you to select the up axis, forward axis, and yeah, we have a bunch of presets for all kinds of different applications here. So Blender, for example, has Z as up, Unreal also, and Unity I think has Y as up, yeah, and they use meters. So I'm just going to use the Blender default preset. One thing that's particularly useful if you want to retarget the motion afterwards is to have a T-pose at frame 0. And in particular for Blender, it's quite useful to add a static root bone. So what this does is when you don't add a root bone, the first bone in the hierarchy is this hips bone. But Blender interprets the first bone in the hierarchy as kind of the origin of the object. So you don't really have the hips bone anymore. So we just add an additional bone before the hips bone, and that makes Blender happy. You can also add a motion, like a root bone that has motion on it. This is useful if you want to capture, for example, a walk cycle and programmatically control the movement of the character in your world. But static root bone is what you want for Blender, and it doesn't really hurt anyone else. So this is pretty much it. I'll just hit save and re-export, and if I look at it, open it in the file manager, look at it, now I have this data for unknown and for unknown 2, my two subjects, and there's the FBX file that I wanted. I think that concludes the tutorial. There's actually one more thing. So we recorded a second take. but we didn't actually re-record like the calibration. So what I'm going to show you next is how to add the second shot and import the calibration from the first shot and how to work with that. So I'll just do the import here again, and that's a walk. And we add the files, and this time we have to add the second file. Oh, I used something twice. It's this one. And now we're going to actually import the calibration file from the other shot that we just did. And there's the camera.calib, and we can just import that. Boom, here we go. We can see that all the cameras are already in the right place. And you can also verify that these lines here actually show where the cameras are supposed to be. So the only thing we have to do is we have to synchronize them again. I think I did a clap actually at some point. I think maybe, oh yeah, here we go. All right, sync panel again. On camera 1. Okay, so this is the frame. 2. So here I'm using the page down button for switching between cameras and the left and right arrows for stepping frames. Clapping tends to be a very good way to synchronize. The only problem is that sometimes you can't see it. Like here, it's a bit difficult to see. So you just have to guess. Maybe this way. Alright, once again, I'm starting with the A pose here. And track. Let's just wait until the filtering's finished and then we'll have a look at the recording. Alright. There was a little bit of a jitter in the head. Very often you can fix these things by just tracking over them backwards. So select the frame, like a frame right after the broken tracking, and then I just track backwards over it. Let's dive right into the second part of this tutorial. So here I'm in our studio and we have a static setup in here. So I only have to recalibrate the system like once a month or so. But let me just demonstrate how to do that. The main advantage of having the cameras mounted statically is obviously that you don't have to calibrate as often. And secondly, that you get live feedback when you do the calibration. Apart from that, the calibration is the same. We have a lens calibration and then a volume calibration. So let's just recalibrate one of the lenses. So I just go to calibrate and then lens, Capture calibration board. One nice feature is that it automatically switches the main view to whatever camera you're calibrating. So I just walk up to any camera now and it'll switch to that view so I can get the feedback whether I've covered the entire field of view sufficiently, and that just makes things easier. Okay. So I've calibrated this camera now and I'm just going to calibrate now. So that was this camera. I'll just hit this delete button, which doesn't delete the calibration, it only deletes the detections so that I can actually see what it's done. And one thing to double check that I've already mentioned is that straight lines look straight. So if I switch back to the live view, you can see that it's a little curved, and this is much nicer. So that's the lens calibration. You'd obviously have to do this for all cameras, or you have to use the copy trick that we used in the earlier part of the tutorial. Okay, so the volume calibration also gives us live feedback. I'll just keep an eye on the screen. All right, that's green enough. Calibrate. so that's an excellent calibration. So the last thing we have to do is put the board on the ground to calibrate the floor. Typically, like a lot of our customers actually have markings on the ground where they put the board every time. That way they know where the origin is, and if they have a virtual world they want to match to the real world, they only have to figure out the offset once, and then every time they calibrate they know where it is. It's always the same. You just have to make sure that you always put it down in the same direction, so like this versus like this, because that reverses the coordinate system. I don't have these markings, so I'll just put it down anywhere. One thing to note, when you do put it on the ground like this, you very often get glare on the board. So let's just increase the camera brightness real quick to demonstrate. So when it looks like this and you can just barely make out the green square, just reduce the brightness until you can see it, and then set the floor. Here we go. So that's the calibration. And if we want to track, we now have to record some motion. Let me just remove the board and then let's get going. Okay, and to record, I'll just hit the record button down here in the shot management panel. Okay, that's it. So I just stayed in the calibrate mode, but it doesn't matter, you can record in any mode. So now let's jump into playback mode. So if you have live cameras attached, it'll actually have this switch down here for switching between live and playback. Alright, so here we go. I'm not doing a proper A pose here anywhere, so I just take this frame because it's kind of standing. Alright, I'll just drag the skeleton on me. There we go, and it tracks. Okay, that's it. Like, I don't have motion for this first bit, so what I'll do is I'll just go to one of the first frames and then I'll track that sequence backwards. Alright, I'll save, switch to filtered view. And this is it. In this tutorial I showed you the main workflows for Captury Studio. Check out the other videos in our YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, stay tuned, and bye bye.